At 0814 hours on August 7, 1942, Flight Petty Officer Saburo Sakai climbed into the cockpit of his Mitsubishi A6M Zero at Rabaul, New Britain, unaware that the mission ahead would shatter everything he believed about his enemy. The tropical heat was already crushing, the air heavy with humidity and thick with the sharp smell of aviation fuel. Sakai moved through his pre-flight checks with the calm precision that had kept him alive through years of combat. He inspected his control surfaces, tested the movement of the stick, and confirmed the ammunition loads in his two 20mm cannons and twin 7.7mm machine guns. Everything was flawless. Just as it always was. At 25 years old, Sakai was already a hardened veteran. He had fought over China, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, and had shot down dozens of Allied aircraft. His hands were steady, his confidence unshakable. He came from a lineage that traced itself to the samurai, warriors who had served Japan for generations. The code of Bushido flowed through his blood. Like many Japanese aviators, he had been taught that Americans were soft and decadent, a people of merchants and pleasure seekers who lacked the discipline, endurance, and spiritual strength of true warriors. That morning, Sakai would learn how catastrophically wrong that belief was. The mission was to intercept American forces landing on an island called Guadalcanal. News had reached Rabaul that very morning of a massive American amphibious assault, the first major offensive launched by the United States since the war began. Sakai and the pilots of the Tainan Air Group were scrambled to strike the invasion force and escort Japanese bombers attacking the American fleet. It would be Sakai's first encounter with U.S. Navy pilots. He had already fought American Army Air Force's pilots in the Philippines and found them brave, but inferior to Japanese aircraft and tactics. Navy pilots, he had heard, were different. They were said to be the elite carrier-trained professionals, the best the Americans could offer. Before takeoff, Squadron Commander Lieutenant Junichi Sasai gathered the pilots. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the packed dirt airfield as they stood in formation. "Be careful," Sasai warned. "These are regular American Navy fighters, not Army planes. This is the first time we will meet them. They are likely the strongest opponents we will face. Never lose sight of my aircraft." Sasai's brother-in-law, Lieutenant Commander Yoshio Toshiro, was stationed at Tulagi with a flying boat unit directly in the path of the American landings. His fate was already sealed, though none of them knew it yet. Within hours, American forces would overwhelm the Japanese garrison there. Sakai climbed into his cockpit, pulled the canopy closed, and began his takeoff roll. The Zero lifted smoothly from the runway and climbed into the morning sky, forming up with the rest of the fighters. Below, the dense green jungle of New Britain stretched endlessly. Ahead lay hundreds of miles of open ocean and an enemy far more dangerous than Japanese pilots had been led to believe. What followed over the next several hours marked the beginning of a profound shift in how Japanese aviators viewed their American opponents. That transformation would unfold over 3 brutal years of Pacific warfare, one dogfight at a time. The beliefs Japanese pilots carried into World War II did not appear by chance. They were the result of decades of deliberate indoctrination, a carefully crafted worldview that placed Japan at the center of a racial and spiritual hierarchy. Japanese military doctrine in 1941 rested on the concept of Yamato Damashi, the Japanese spirit. This was not simple patriotism. It was a near-religious conviction that Japanese soldiers possessed an innate spiritual superiority, capable of overcoming any material disadvantage. Spirit would triumph over steel. Willpower would defeat technology. Victory was considered inevitable, ordained by the divine ancestry of the Japanese people descending from the sun goddess, Amaterasu herself. This belief system had deep historical roots. For centuries, The samurai class dominated Japanese society, governed by Bushido honor, absolute loyalty, and death before surrender. When Japan modernized in the late 19th century, these samurai ideals were deliberately infused into the new conscript army. Every soldier was taught that he was a spiritual heir to the samurai, regardless of his background. The doctrine seemed validated in 1905, when Japan defeated Imperial Russia, stunning the Western world. A small Asian nation had humbled a major European power. Japanese military theorists concluded that this victory proved the supremacy of spirit over material strength. Russia had more ships, more men, and more industry. Japan had Yamato Damashi, and spirit had prevailed in the decades that followed. Military propaganda relentlessly reinforced these ideas. Americans were portrayed as weak, materialistic, and lacking any true warrior tradition. Japanese newspapers and films depicted them as decadent, cowardly, and morally corrupt people who would collapse at the first sign of real resistance. Wartime cinema often portrayed American soldiers as physically inferior and spiritually empty, incapable of standing against the purity and resolve of Japanese warriors. The armed forces were told Americans could not fight in jungles, could not endure hardship, and could not withstand sustained combat of any kind. This contempt extended especially toward American pilots. Some Japanese theorists argued before the war that Americans were inherently poor aviators, lacking the discipline and spiritual strength required for aerial combat. One analysis even claimed Americans had a defective sense of balance that made them unsuited for flying. Their love of comfort and self-preservation, it was believed, would cause them to break and flee when faced with warriors unafraid of death. Japanese pilot training reinforced this sense of superiority. It was among the most demanding programs in the world, accepting only a handful from thousands of applicants. Those who were selected endured 2 to 3 years of intense training, often accumulating 700 hours of flight time before entering combat. They trained relentlessly in gunnery, navigation, formation flying, and aerobatics until every movement became instinctive. They learned to push their aircraft to its absolute limits. The training was also brutally physical. Recruits were beaten with rattan sticks for even minor mistakes. Sakai later recalled passing out from the punishment only to be revived with cold water and beaten again. Suffering in silence was expected. By comparison, many American pilots early in the war had far less experience. The U.S. military had been small in peacetime, its training programs limited. Many American aviators entered combat with only a few hundred flight hours, some even less. To seasoned Japanese veterans, they appeared to be inexperienced, boys flying inferior machines. What Sakai and his comrades would soon discover over Guadalcanal was that this confidence, this belief in automatic superiority, was built on a dangerous illusion. The assessment appeared reasonable when judged by the evidence available at the time. American pre-war fighter designs, aircraft such as the P-36 and the F-2A Buffalo, were clearly inferior when compared to the Zero. Japanese pilots who had evaluated captured American aircraft confirmed these weaknesses. Every indicator suggested that victory would come easily. The opening months of the war seemed to validate every Japanese expectation. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, each campaign ended in rapid success. Japanese Zeros ruled the skies, destroying American P-40 Warhawks, P-39 Airacobras, and F-2A Buffaloes with Apparentis. In the Philippines, Japanese pilots eliminated much of the American Air Force on the ground during the initial attacks and decisively defeated the remaining aircraft in aerial combat. The kill ratios were overwhelmingly FAVOURABLE. American pilots who survived these early encounters described a Zero as nearly unbeatable, a fighter that could climb faster, turn tighter, and maneuver better than anything available to the Allies. Among Japanese aviators, these victories fueled what historians would later describe as victory disease. They became convinced that their uninterrupted success confirmed everything they had been taught about racial and spiritual superiority. The Americans were exactly as weak as propaganda had claimed. The war, they believed, would end quickly, and Japan would emerge as the dominant power in Asia. But then came Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima was among Japan's most experienced fighter leaders. He had flown in combat since the war in China and commanded some of the Imperial Navy's finest pilots. During a mission over Guadalcanal in August 1942, Nakajima encountered something that left him furious when he returned to Rabaul. He easily positioned himself behind an American F4F Wildcat. The Wildcat was slower than his Zero, less agile, and inferior by nearly every measurable standard. Nakajima lined up his shot, ready to add another victory to his record. Then, without warning, a second Wildcat attacked from the side. Forced to break off, Nakajima tried to re-engage. Each time he closed in on one American fighter, the other swung around to threaten him. The two Wildcats weaved back and forth, covering each other and denying him a clean firing solution. For the first time in his combat career, Nakajima was forced to dive away and flee. Saburo Sakai witnessed similar engagements. He later recalled the confusion Japanese pilots felt when they first encountered this tactic. Lieutenant Commander Nakajima, Sakai explained, had faced what would later become a well-known enemy maneuver. Two Wildcats attacked him together. He could easily get behind one opponent, but before he could fire, the second Grumman would charge in from the side. What the Japanese pilots had encountered was the Thatch weave, a defensive tactic developed by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch of the United States Navy. Thatch had studied intelligence reports describing the Zero's remarkable capabilities long before he faced it in battle. A Fleet Air Tactical Unit Bulletin, dated September 22, 1941, described the new Japanese fighter as possessing extraordinary MRI and climb performance, capable of ascending at more than 5,000 feet per minute, and executing turns that would cause most American fighters to stall, rather than accept that the Zero was invincible. Thatch spent countless evenings at his dining room table in Coronado, California, using matchsticks to represent aircraft. He moved them through imagined combat scenarios, searching for a way to counter the Zero's advantages. Night after night, he tested ideas, discarding failures until one concept finally worked. The solution was strikingly simple. Two fighters would fly in a wide formation, separated enough that an enemy could not attack both at once. When a Zero engaged one aircraft, both American fighters would turn toward each other in a series of weaving maneuvers. Focused on its target, the Zero would suddenly find itself crossing directly in front of the second Wildcat. The Japanese pilot would be forced either to abandon the attack or risk being shot down from an unexpected angle. Thatch originally called this the BM defense. Position. History would remember it as the Thatch weave. The tactic relied on something Japanese pilots initially regarded as a weakness: teamwork over individual achievement. Japanese training emphasized personal skill and lone warrior combat. Like the samurai of old, pilots sought personal victory, individual kill counts, and recognition as aces who brought honor to their families. American training, by contrast, increasingly emphasized mutual support, protecting one's wingmen, and placing collective survival above personal glory. Thatch tested his maneuver in training with fellow pilot Butch O'Hare before either had faced the Zero in combat. At the Battle of Midway in June 1942, he finally employed it against Japanese fighters. His flight of 6 Wildcats from Fighting Squadron 3 aboard the USS Yorktown was escorting torpedo bombers when they were suddenly attacked by 15 to 20 Zeros. The situation should have been disastrous. The Zeros were faster, more agile, and outnumbered the Wildcats by at least 3 to 1. One Wildcat was immediately set on fire. Another lost its radio. That left only 4 fighters against a swarm of enemy aircraft. Thatch initiated the weave with his wingman. Ensign Ram Dib, still inexperienced, followed the maneuver exactly as practiced. Turning toward Thatch when a Zero locked onto his tail, Thatch watched as enemy fighters slid into firing position behind his wingman. With so many Japanese aircraft overhead, he doubted whether anything could work. Then the Zero followed Dib through his turn, exactly as Thatch had anticipated. The enemy aircraft crossed directly in front of him, its underside exposed. Thatch squeezed the trigger and held it. The Zero erupted in flames. The pattern repeated itself throughout the engagement. Zeros that expected easy kills instead found themselves caught in intersecting fields of fire. The weave disrupted their attacks and denied them the clean shots they were accustomed to when facing isolated American fighters. While the tactic could not win battles outright, it saved lives and changed the balance of air combat. Sakai himself later acknowledged this difference in a post-war interview. "I am confident Japanese pilots were superior in one-on-one combat," he said. But the Americans' ability to operate as a team, both offensively and defensively, was extremely impressive. Perhaps it comes from their team spirit developed in sports like American football. This affected us deeply from the middle of the war onward. They all wanted to win, and with each battle, they became stronger. His observation revealed a truth that Japanese pilots struggled to accept. The Americans were not fighting for individual honor. They were fighting as coordinated units focused solely on victory, and they were improving with every engagement. That same day, as Nakajima returned angrily to Rabaul, Saburo Sakai experienced an encounter that would stay with him for years. The skies above Guadalcanal were chaotic. Japanese bombers attacked the American fleet, while Zeros clashed with defending fighters. Smoke rose from burning ships below, and gunfire crackled across radio channels. Sakai had already damaged several enemy aircraft when he spotted what appeared to be a formation of American fighters. He counted 8 aircraft flying together, their silhouettes suggesting F4F Wildcats, to an experienced Zero pilot approaching from behind. They seemed like easy targets. Sakai banked his aircraft and began his attack, climbing slightly to gain altitude before diving toward the unsuspecting Americans. As he closed the distance, he suddenly realized his mistake. The aircraft were not Wildcats. They were SPD Dauntless dive bombers, each carrying a rear gunner armed with twin .30 caliber machine guns, weapons specifically designed to repel attacking fighters. Sakai had flown straight into a deadly trap. The dauntless gunners opened fire at the same instant. A torrent of .30 caliber bullets slammed into Sakai's cockpit. The noise was deafening, metal hammering against metal, the sharp crack of rounds ripping through the canopy. Sakai felt impacts strike all around him. One bullet hit him in the head. It shattered his goggles, grazed his skull, and tore through his forehead. The impact instantly blinded his right eye and left him unable to see from the left as blood poured into it. Half of his body went numb as damaged nerves robbed him of sensation. His Zero, now uncontrolled, rolled violently and plunged toward the ocean below. The pain was beyond description. Later, Sakai compared the sensation to having his head split open with an axe. He could not see, could not move properly, and could barely think through the overwhelming agony. Blood covered his face and filled his mouth. The altimeter spun rapidly as the aircraft dove toward the sea. By any reasonable standard, Sakai should have been dead. The wound was catastrophic, the kind that either kills instantly or leaves a pilot too. incapacitated to do anything but crash. He was hundreds of miles from base, flying over open ocean, surrounded by enemy aircraft, piloting a severely damaged plane with failing systems. Most pilots would have gone straight into the water. Many would have lost consciousness long before impact. Sakai did not surrender. Fighting through waves of pain and disorientation, he managed to regain partial control of the aircraft. His right hand still responded, and he could feel the control stick. He pulled back just enough to halt the dive mere moments above the wave tops. The Zero leveled out, skimming across the ocean's surface. He could not see well enough to navigate. Remaining conscious required constant effort. Still, he knew the general direction of Rabaul. If he flew long enough on that heading, he might reach land. Using dead reckoning, he pointed his battered Zero southwest and began the longest flight of his life. For 4 hours and 47 minutes, Sakai flew 640 miles across open ocean in a crippled fighter. He fought sleep relentlessly, biting his lip until it bled, striking himself with his working hand, doing anything to stay awake. Occasionally, blood cleared from his left eye, long enough for him to glimpse his instruments before vision vanished again. Several times, he considered surrendering to the inevitable. The pain was unbearable. The distance felt impossible. He knew he was dying. Yet something kept him airborne, a mix of discipline, pride, and sheer stubborn resolve that refused to let him perish in the sea. When he finally reached Rabaul, he nearly collided with a row of parked aircraft. His fuel gauge read empty. He circled the airfield 4 times, struggling to line up a landing with one barely functioning eye. On his second attempt, he managed to bring the Zero down on the runway. Ground crews rushed toward the aircraft, horrified by what they saw. Sakai's face was drenched in blood. His canopy was riddled with bullet holes. The aircraft itself was so badly damaged that it should never have made it back. Yet Sakai was not finished. After landing, he refused medical attention until he had delivered his formal mission report. He climbed from the cockpit, stood at attention despite his injuries, and reported to his commanding officer with strict military precision. Only after completing his duty did he allow medics to take him away. The wound ended Sakai's frontline combat career for nearly 2 years. The bullet had permanently destroyed the vision in his right eye. Though the left eye eventually recovered, it was never the same. The paralysis slowly faded, but the psychological scars remained. Before being evacuated to Japan for surgery and recovery, Sakai had time to reflect on what had happened over Guadalcanal. The Americans had not collapsed. They had not fled. They had fought with a determination and competence that Japanese propaganda insisted did not exist. Their gunners had held their ground and fired accurately even as Zero fighters closed in. And they had shot him down. The relentless air battles over Guadalcanal forced a slow and painful reassessment of how Japanese pilots viewed their enemy. The Marine pilots flying from Henderson Field were not elite aviators by pre-war standards. Many had little combat experience. Some had arrived barely qualified to fly under combat conditions. Their Wildcats were undeniably inferior to the Zero, on paper slower by roughly 15 miles per hour, less maneuverable in every direction, unable to climb or turn with a Japanese fighter. On paper, every encounter should have favored Japan, but the reality of combat proved otherwise. The Americans possessed advantages that could not be measured in specifications. Their aircraft were rugged, built to absorb punishment that would destroy a Zero. A Wildcat could take dozens of hits from Japanese machine guns and remain airborne. Its pilots sacked behind armor plating, capable of stopping bullets that would have been fatal in a Japanese cockpit. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing, closing around bullet holes instead of leaking fuel that could ignite. Japanese designers had sacrificed all of this for performance. The Zero was light, agile, and deadly, but extremely vulnerable. A single well-placed burst from a Wildcat's .50 caliber machine guns could send the Zero spiraling downward in flames. The Japanese pilot had no self-sealing tanks, and no protection once hit. The very qualities that made the Zero dominant in a dogfight made it fatally exposed if an enemy ever achieved a clean shot. Even more significant was how rapidly American tactics evolved. Pilots who survived their first encounters learned harsh lessons and applied them immediately. Intelligence officers conducted thorough debriefings after every mission, identifying successes and failures and spreading effective tactics throughout the force. When one pilot discovered a useful counter to a Japanese maneuver, the information was recorded, analyzed, and distributed to every squadron in the theater. New rules emerged. Never dogfight a Zero at low speed. Never follow it in a climb. Never pursue a retreating Zero. It might be setting a trap. Instead, attack from altitude. Dive, fire once, and climb away before the enemy can respond. Always fight in pairs. Protect your wingman. Accept that your aircraft is slower and less maneuverable, and turn those weaknesses into tactical advantages. The Japanese system operated differently. Individual achievement was valued above institutional learning. Ace pilots were celebrated in newspapers and radio broadcasts, their faces printed on posters and cigarette cards, their techniques spoken of with reverence. But those techniques often vanished with the pilots themselves. There was little organized effort to capture lessons and distribute them across the force. Veteran pilots were kept in combat until they were killed or disabled, rather than rotated home to train replacements and pass on their knowledge. The consequences became evident in the numbers. Japan lost 36 aircraft over Guadalcanal in the first 2 days of fighting. The Americans lost 19, many due to accidents rather than enemy action. That ratio remained relatively consistent over the following months. Japanese pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced, and each loss erased years of irreplaceable training and experience. Not by late 1942. Concerns began to surface among Japanese aviators, filtering through intelligence reports and private conversations. The Americans were not fighting as propaganda had promised. They were not cowards who broke under pressure. They did not panic when faced with superior aircraft. Instead, they adapted, learned from every encounter, improved their tactics, and returned stronger each week. No matter how many American planes were shot down, more appeared the next day. Their supply seemed endless. An endless stream of aircraft and pilots continued to arrive from bases that Japanese bombers could not reach. The Americans were now fighting a war of attrition, and Japan was losing it. The transformation accelerated when the United States introduced new aircraft designed specifically to counter Japanese advantages. In September 1943, a new fighter appeared over the Pacific, the Grumman F6F Hellcat. It was everything the Zero was not. Large, heavy, and heavily armored. It was powered by a 2,000 horsepower engine that delivered speed and climb, performance the Zero could no longer match. Japanese pilots describe it thire, arrival as a rude awakening. The Hellcat could absorb punishment that would have destroyed a Zero and continue flying. It could dive away from combat at speeds the Zero could not follow. Armed with 6 50C ALIB-RE machine guns, it could tear apart the lightly built Japanese fighters with a brief, devastating burst. Most importantly, the Hellcat was forgiving to fly. American pilots could be trained quickly and sent into combat with a reasonable chance of survival. They lived long enough to learn. The Zero demanded years of mastery. The Hellcat required months. Around the same time, the F4U Corsair entered service, another powerful fighter that outclassed Japanese aircraft. Marine and Navy squadrons equipped with these planes began achieving kill ratios that would have been unimaginable just a year earlier. Where Guadalcanal had been roughly balanced, air combat in 1943 increasingly became one-sided. American victories. Japanese veterans noticed the change immediately. Tactics that worked against Wildcats failed against the Hellcats. American pilots refused to engage in turning battles where the Zero still held some advantage. Instead, they attacked from altitude, made high-speed firing passes, and dove away before Japanese fighters could respond. They fought in pairs and coordinated flights, covering one another at all times and avoiding isolation. Saburo Sakai, who returned to limited flying duty in 1944 after partially recovering from his wounds, found a completely different war from the one he had left. Putting a young pilot with only about 20 hours of flight time into an aircraft and telling him to fight American pilots flying Hellcats and Corsairs, he later said, was just as suicidal as sending him on a kamikaze mission. He added, if they were going to die anyway, the kamikaze attack would at least cause more damage to the enemy for the same price in lives. This grim logic reflected the brutal calculation reached Bithi Japanese command. Conventional air combat could no longer be won. The only remaining option was to trade lives directly for ships. The catastrophic losses among Japanese pilots stemmed from a strategic miscalculation so fundamental that it shaped the outcome of the Pacific Air War more than any single battle. Japan had entered the war with roughly 6,000 trained pilots, of whom about 900 were considered elite capable of the most demanding combat missions. This force was built for a short, decisive war, similar to the conflicts Japan had fought against China and Russia. Japanese planners believed they could strike hard at the outset, cripple American forces, and force a negotiated settlement before U.S. industrial power could be fully mobilized. When that assumption proved false, when America responded to Pearl Harbor with resolve instead of despair, the pilot shortage became critical. The flaw was structural, embedded in Japan's entire approach to military aviation. Japanese pilot training was designed to produce a small elite of exceptional quality. The selection process eliminated nearly all applicants, accepting only the most talented. Training programs lasted years rather than months, producing superb aviators, but incapable of scaling to meet wartime demand. American pilot training expanded dramatically after Pearl Harbor, transforming from a modest peacetime effort into an industrial-scale operation. The United States ultimately trained nearly 200,000 pilots during the war. This effort drew from a civilian population already familiar with machines, engines, and vehicles. Many American recruits had grown up working on cars and motorcycles. Some had flown civilian aircraft before enlistment. This mechanical familiarity gave them a critical advantage. American flight schools operated continuously, processing waves of students through standardist programs designed to produce capable combat pilots quickly without sacrificing essential skills. Primary training lasted 10 weeks. Intermediate training added 11 more. Advanced fighter training required an additional 6 weeks, followed by operational training with combat units. The pipeline never stopped. Each month, hundreds of new pilots graduate and move to frontline squadrons. At the same time, experienced combat pilots rotated home to serve as instructors, passing hard-earned lessons to the next generation. The system was built for a prolonged war of attrition, the very kind of war Japan could not sustain. Japan, by contrast, graduated only about 46,000 pilots during the entire war, less than a quarter of the American total. Nearly half of these were produced in 1944, rushed through shortened programs that yielded dangerously undertrained aviators. The rigorous training that had made Japanese pilots the finest in the world early in the war was abandoned out of necessity. There was simply no time. By early 1945, Some Japanese Navy pilots graduated with as little as 40 hours of flight time. Some had never fired their weapons in training. Others had never landed on a carrier before being assigned to combat units. Their American opponents typically entered combat with over 525 flight hours, including extensive training in gunnery, navigation, and formation tactics. The experienced Japanese, veterans who had dominated the early war, were steadily eliminated through attrition. Unlike the Americans, Japan did not rotate its best pilots home to train replacements. They remained in combat until killed or disabled. Years of accumulated experience vanished in moments when an ace was shot down. Japanese commanders understood the danger but saw no solution. Removing veterans from frontline units to train others would weaken already strained squadrons. They chose instead to keep their best pilots fighting, gambling that skill could compensate for American numbers. The gamble failed. One by one, Japan's aces disappeared. Hiroji Nishizawa, regarded by many as Japan's greatest fighter pilot, was killed when his transport aircraft was shot down in October 1944. He had survived years of combat only to die as a passenger. Tetsuzo Iwamoto, credited with over 80 victories, was wounded and removed from combat. The list of experienced pilots grew shorter with each passing month. The Americans suffered losses as well, but their system absorbed them. When an American squadron lost pilots, replacements arrived within weeks, trained to a consistent standard and ready to integrate. When a Japanese squadron lost pilots, replacements often arrived barely qualified to fly, let alone fight seasoned opponents. Admiral Chisaburo Ozawa recognized the crisis when he gathered Japan's remaining carrier forces for what became the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. Pilots were largely inexperienced, products of the shortened training programs. Many had never landed on a carrier. Some had never released a torpedo. Others struggled with basic formation flying. Ozawa hoped land-based aircraft from Guam and the surrounding islands would compensate for these weaknesses. His strategy relied on the Japanese aircraft's longer range to strike American forces before U.S. planes could reach his carriers.